I said I'll go to the gym. No, I don't want to talk about the gym. We'll talk about, let me see, I'll read Damasio's book this week. And think, oh, okay, I'll read a chapter of Damasio's book this week. No, okay, I'll read a page of Damasio. No, I've got something else. So, and it goes like that. It's hopeless. It's a recipe for failure. And I just hate it. This is a kind of statement you get from goal-setting researchers. It says basically that as long as you want to do it and you've got the ability to do it, and you haven't got anything else on at the time, you'll probably do it. So that makes me want to run around the room screaming. I'm going to tell you a story. This is the way it happens for me. That's a place called Kildavnet. It's on the coast of County Mayo in the west of Ireland. It's a very special place. This is known as Granuail's Tower. And I went there for a reason. I made a sketch. Granuail was a 16th century chieftainess. She was an O'Malley. She was a bit of a pirate. And she had a conversation with Elizabeth I at one point. Their only common language was Latin. So she was a highly educated woman, didn't speak English. I read a story about her once, and she visited a Fili. Now, a Fili is a kind of a poet, a bard, sometimes an educator. He would have taught her Greek and Latin when she was a child, because she was the daughter of a chief. Although she was chosen for the role, in those days the Irish clans used to choose their leaders. She went to speak to Elizabeth about not imposing the rules of succession, the English rules of succession on the Irish people. She wasn't successful in that regard, but Elizabeth liked her, and so she got to keep her land. She went to visit this Fili in a tower, probably this one. And the upstairs room of the tower, this man had arranged around the walls his harps, so that his voice would ring in the room, a bit of theatre, and he liked this. That image stuck with me. That was many, many years ago that I read this story. But the image was very powerful for me and it stuck with me. So, many years later, perhaps 20 years later, I had in my 40s done a master's degree in psychotherapy. My marriage had been dissolved and a lot of changes had taken place. And I found myself living in a house. It wasn't a tower, but I was living in a house by the sea. And around the walls of the house were arranged 3 harps, 2 guitars, a couple of mandolins, a Greek bouzouki, an Irish bouzouki, a sitar, and an Indian sitar, and 1 or 2 other things like that. Yeah? So how did that happen? I didn't even think about it. But in the words, if I can paraphrase the Gospel according to John, the Word became flesh. Something had happened without me really even thinking. Now, this is not about attracting things to me in a vortex, that sort of nonsense. If I can be very un-MI for a little bit of being compassionate and understanding for a day and a half, I'm having a reaction to it. So that vortex stuff is rubbish and its author is certifiably nuts. And having got that out of my system, I can now be compassionate again. But that's not what it's about. That's one of my harps. There's some others. My partner, who turned up about 13 years after my marriage was dissolved, is a professional harpist. So that added to the picture. That's her concert harp.
The moment.
Oh, go back. So that's a story about change that I don't understand, I didn't understand, but it's a story about how things change and about what changes. So the question is, what changed? It was not about goal setting, and it was both catastrophic and incremental. So what is it that changes? Here's some other views. This is Lydia Edwards. Now, Lydia is an interesting person to talk to. She's a psychotherapist like me. She works with me in the therapeutic community. I work in Dunedin. And she's a person who, for the last 20-something years, has been in recovery from alcoholism. So these factors make her an interesting person to ask questions like this. This is her.
The moment of profound change from a chaotic, addicted lifestyle.
Yeah.
To the possibility of some coherence. Yeah?
Well, it's like, I can't do it. I'm stuffed. I'm done for. I'm beaten, So my resources have come to an absolute end. And there's little signs along the way with, debts, problems in relationships, physical health problems, and it keeps kind of like coming back until it becomes like a juggernaut. You know, it's like whack, and then I'm down on my knees, I'm crying, and it's like once I hit the tears, I've surrendered. I give up, and I don't know what to do, and something changes there. But it's got something to do with asking, because all that you have to believe in is a power bigger than yourself, and that's not hard for anyone.
You're making yourself two words?
Self being the little self.
Right, little.
Yeah, so the big self inside of me suddenly motivates in, suddenly moves in, and something becomes wide and big.
Okay, the next up on the stage is an American novelist called Marilyn Robinson. To all intents and purposes, she's a committed Christian, which would normally alienate me, but she was really interesting. She was a woman who, having got a PhD, decided that she wasn't very well educated and started reading the books that people quoted. So she started reading Calvin and Marx, and when Marx quoted somebody, she'd go and read that, and so on. So I thought this was pretty impressive. This is an extract from a Radio New Zealand interview. The first voice is the interviewers.
Can we just talk about predestination for a second? This is the question, you know, that Jack, the prodigal son Jack, says in both Gilead and in Home. Reverend Ames, I'd like to know your views on the doctrine of predestination. In other words, as Reverend Ames's wife says, in a much more down-to-earth way, can people change?
I think that often when people quote-unquote change, they really do become themselves. You know what I mean? It's not like a difference enters into them. It's like for some reason or other they've been distracted away from their own, you know, human center. One of the things that I really do like in Calvin is his suggestion that God's response to human beings is aesthetic. And that he enjoys people. And I like the idea, when I was writing Jack, that idea was sort of in my mind, that I was creating a character that about whom one could not confidently say much in terms of his sort of curriculum vitae, but at the same time someone whom God might enjoy, you know, a different notion of goodness. He's not changing away from himself, he's changing toward himself. You know, it's a recovery of integrity in a sense.
So I thought that was absolutely stunning, incredibly beautiful, beautiful world. So next on the stage, the last of my three people, another one that I interviewed, was my old supervisor. His name is Wilson Daniel. He's a doctor of theology, a barrister, and a union analyst. So he, as you might imagine, is also an interesting person to talk to, and he takes a classical view of change.
Several years ago in Southern California, I did some extensive research on conversion, faith conversion. And of course you can think of major historical personalities such as Saul, who became Paul, and this was as a result of a very radical change in his whole approach to life, a persecutor, and eventually became one of the leading humanitarians. The metanoia, the change around, it's like a volte-face. You're one person one day, and you change completely. Yes. But in many ways, it's a sudden discovery of the real self.
And he becomes something of a poet.
Yes.
You know, his letters are
quite poetic,
beautifully written. Yeah.
The letter to Timothy is really a father-son letter.
Yeah,
it's a beautiful letter.
Yeah.
One would like to think that one could be to one's own son that sort of person.
So I work with people who change profoundly. I see profound change many times. It's most noticeable not working with somebody over a period of time so we see a little bit here and there, but not seeing somebody for 5 or 10 years and then bumping into them and thinking, my God, where did you come from? I didn't see this coming, yeah? And suddenly you've got a different person in front of you, somebody who's leading a completely different kind of life. what is that? What is that happens? What is it that changed? These ideas I find attractive. The big self, says Lydia. Marilyn Robinson says, the human center. A real self, says Wilson. And Marilyn says, a person whom God, if there were a God for the non-believers, might enjoy. So interesting ideas. What are we talking about here? Little diversion, coexisting problems, dual diagnosis, comorbidity, that sort of thing, etc., etc. This is a quote from a study from Simon Thompson, who's a psychologist at the National Addiction Centre in Christchurch. AOD population should be considered part of a larger population of mental health patients with coexisting psychiatric conditions, so the rules, not the exception. And there are studies to show that. It's easy to find this sort of stuff. This is 100 people who walked into alcohol and drug clinics, two clinics in New Zealand, and they filled out a screening tool, and those are the results. Interesting stuff. The zero, of course, you don't tend to diagnose conduct disorder in adults. These are adults. But the 50% in the lifetime column, 50% of these people with a history of conduct disorder, that's a huge figure. It's enormously above the normal population. What on earth is that about? Any mood disorder in the lifetime occurrence of 73% of anxiety, 77% put them together, 90% of them have a history of these things. So what are we looking at? Are we looking at somebody who's got like a broken leg and the flu? Or are we looking at something more central, kind of disorder of the person? That's the kind of view that as a psychotherapist I tend to take. This is one of I collected these. The 16 things across the top are individuals. The rows, of course, are disorders. Another screening too. The turquoise areas are where an individual met the criterion. The magenta areas are where the average met or exceeded the criterion. So there's a visual representation of the same kind of data that the last table showed you. Those are 16 consecutive admissions to the therapeutic community where I work. They've all come from prison on electronic restraints on parole. So a reasonably average bunch of male prisoners. Let's see. Okay, so one of the things that I one of the ways of thinking about it is in terms of schema, basic schema within us. What is it that's disordered? What is it that changes? What is it that produces that kind of change? And attachment schema are an obvious place to go to. I teach attachment schema like I did teach it. I don't know if I'll ever use this again because it's not a very good way to teach it. It's the way the textbooks talk about it. I'll show you how I teach it to clients in a second. This is where I start. I have been teaching it to adults. So, sense of self is formed from a balance of connection and exploration. That's the basic secure attachment formula. So you get secure attachment, you get a good balance. If you sacrifice one of those things, you go off the rails one way or the other. If you sacrifice connection because there isn't any, you develop avoidant attachment and you're good at exploration. If you go the other way, if there's enough attachment, enough connection to keep you working at it, then you sacrifice exploration in terms of relationship and you become ambivalent or preoccupied in adulthood. The third dimension, which is created, according to Mary Main, by fear. Either the parent is frightening or frightened, produces disorganization, or in adulthood, unresolved attachment. So, theoretical schema, that's the field. I don't know if I'll ever use it again, but this one works much better. Clients get this, and almost always there's a kind of sudden reaction to it. Do I have these guys? And this is a kind of a best of all possible worlds. She had a reasonable idea about life. She's born of the same-sex parent. He has to move away a little bit to get an identity, but it's in this example readily available. So what happens if you get one of these or one of these? Now you can reverse the heads if you like. It doesn't matter, but this is more common configuration. She still gets a picture, different picture from last time. so does he. We remove these guys, and we take her away because her story is different, and my understanding of women is still limited. So I'm not even going to try to talk about her. Much too dangerous. Let's grow him up a little bit. He's now beginning to resemble a parental figure a bit more, because I think that feels much better than the original position. He's got some identity and some power. Within him, of course, he still has the little guy somewhere. So who's he going to recognize in the world? Who's he going to see? Who's he going to meet? Who's he going to hang out with? I want to show that to a group of guys who've come out of prison who literacy may be a little dubious, and their capacity for abstract thoughts is a bit questionable. They tend to get it. It's not that hard to get, and it strikes a chord. Well, this is the way of working with people about central change. It's not about goal setting, it's about identity, it's about who you are. This is Antonio Damasio's idea of how the self is constructed. Homeostatic feedback systems in the body, not so much in the limbic system, but in the brainstem. The body changes in response to a stimulus, and that change is mapped, and that is an emotion. That's how an emotion arises. Meanings assigned to it at a cortical level, and on a higher level than that, cognition and a conscious, enduring sense of self emerges because of a continuity, that the same kind of feelings arise again and again, the same interpretations, the same thoughts about them. So that's the self. And the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate and the insula are candidates for that. And of course, it's a downward cascade, because then the thinking affects the emotional state and reinforces it normally. So it's a very stable sort of thing. Despite Anya's suggestion that I woke up this morning, I know who I am, but actually, I may be somebody different. The experience changes much more slowly than that. I'm getting signals from Helen. She's doing a really good job. Changes in that cascade are catastrophic. It's a huge thing to change, but that's the job. So the catastrophic experience is the road to Damascus things. And it takes place, interestingly, in a predictable direction, which are exactly the values which are echoed by MI and by 12-step programs. Generosity, a focus on relationships, humility, joy, gratitude, those kinds of things. So I'll slip through this because I haven't really got time. The main point is that motivational interviewing invites profound change by evoking a natural movement towards the basic human self, towards our basic nature, which we have in common. That's to say, a stable, cognitive, emotional, homeostatic hierarchy. Cascading change in that may be incremental or catastrophic. Rather, by getting there by setting goals, the individual becomes themselves. The individual becomes someone who is capable of achieving goals, rather than by setting goals. Thank you for listening.